Jimmy Carter, 39th President of the United States. He was born in Georgia, Plains, Georgia. Now, Jimmy grew up during segregation, and though he had many black friends growing up, once he became a teenager, he noticed a change. For example, going into a building, his black friends would step back and let him go in first. At his house, black people had to come in through the back door. He joined the Navy, was very bookish, kind of kept to himself. He became a nuclear engineer and married Rosalind Smith, a friend of his sister. Now, Rosalind loved the military life. She wanted to get out of Plains, Georgia, loved to go traveling. So they lived on many military bases, but then, when Jimmy's father died, he decided to return to Georgia to run the farm. Now, this angered Jimmy's brother Billy, who had been running the farm all these years while Jimmy was gone, and Rosalind herself was very angry, but they returned, ran the farm, were in dire economic straits. They didn't make a profit for about 2 years, but he kept at it. Jimmy Carter was very, very persistent. But they prospered. Then Jimmy decided to run for the state senate, and he won. And then he decided to run for governor in the heavily prejudiced and segregated Georgia, and he lost. He was devastated. He had campaigned tirelessly and even neglected his family. You see, it's one thing to have drive. It's another thing to be driven. And Jimmy was very driven. It was at this point that Jimmy had a spiritual awakening. He became a born-again Christian, started preaching, knocking on doors. Little did the neighbors know that in 10 years' time, this man who knocked on their door to talk about Jesus would become President of the United States. He ran for governor again, a little deceptively, because he catered to the black vote now that African Americans were voting in greater numbers thanks to the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, but he also catered to the racist South who wanted segregation to stay in place. But once he won, he said that segregation had to stop, and many of his white constituents felt betrayed. He fought many enemies on his one term as governor. Then this peanut farmer, one-term governor decided to run for president, though most people nationwide didn't even know who he was. Yet he assembled a team, knocked on doors, and campaigned 18 hours a day for 2 years. He also knew that after Vietnam and Watergate, the American people wanted an outsider, and he promised them that he would never tell a lie. Now, he was long on style, but short on substance. It became a tight race. But in 1976, he became President of the United States. One of his first acts as president was giving a full pardon to the draft dodgers who refused to go to Vietnam. That was fine, but the Democrats wanted a return to the social programs of Lyndon B. Johnson, thinking that Jimmy would reinstate the ones that were discontinued. No deal. Jimmy said he wanted a balanced budget and would veto any program that threatened that. Now, it may seem fiscally wise to some, but to the Washington insiders, this was partisan treason. He didn't believe in quid pro quo or making deals. He wouldn't do things because it was politically good for him. Now, LBJ got things done because he knew when to fight and when to give in and compromise. Because there was a deficit and an energy crisis, he led by example, pulling plugs around the White House, managing schedules even for the tennis courts. He would play with the thermostat. There would be no alcohol at White House functions, no fancy breakfast. Parties ended at midnight to avoid paying staff overtime. He even sold the White House yacht. Now, he did fulfill one promise. When the contract over supervision of the Panama Canal was up, he honored the American commitment to hand the canal back over to Panama. But this was very unpopular. Then, bombshell. Jimmy's good friend Bert Lance, who was the budget director, was under investigation for some bank fraud and dealings. And though he was never found guilty of any crime, it seemed very suspicious. Now, Bert Lance eventually resigned, but Jimmy Carter stood by him for so long and so resolutely that the man who had promised the American people that he would never tell a lie now seemed like just another politician. Carter deregulated the airlines. He spoke endlessly about energy conservation. He made arms deals with the Soviets, and he formalized relationships with the Chinese. Jimmy Carter made human rights a cornerstone of his foreign policy. It was very noble to speak out against torture and political prisoners, but it may have been unwise to recommend economic sanctions not just for our enemies but also our friends, possibly giving encouragement to leftist governments in Salvador and Nicaragua. However, the United States did not sanction Iran, even though the Shah of Iran led a repressive regime. You see, the Shah and Iran had an empire of oil, and Carter invited the Shah and his wife to the White House, where protesters yelled and threw tear gas. Now, during the Carter years, there was stagflation. Stagflation is the rare occurrence of high inflation and unemployment and slow growth. Partly this was due to the revolution that broke out in Iran, leading to oil crisis and gas shortages. If you were around in 1979, you remember those long gas lines. Well, Carter went on the air, spoke on television to the American people, but unfortunately, all he said was that we had a crisis of purpose and that we needed to sacrifice and hang tough. Well, that's not what people wanted to hear. They wanted solutions, not lectures. In Iran, the Shah was overthrown, and the Iranian people called out for the return of Islamic leader Ayatollah Khomeini. So the Shah had to leave the country with his family, and Khomeini returned and took over. People blamed Carter for his floundering state of affairs. During that time, the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, became the first Arab leader to reach out to Israel and look for peace. Egypt had long lost land to Israel during a past war and wanted it back, and for that land, Sadat was willing to recognize Israel as a nation and have peace. The Prime Minister of Israel received him, and they talked. Now, other Arab leaders saw Sadat as a traitor, but he was determined. He graced Time magazine as Man of the Year, the person who most dominated the world news, for better or for worse. Unfortunately, the negotiations fell apart, so entered Jimmy Carter. He invited both of them to Camp David to work it out. The drama was intense. Would they work out a peace plan? For 13 days, the world waited as a Jew, an Arab, and a Christian talked and argued. And then, dramatically, the descendants of Isaac, of Israel, and Ishmael of Egypt signed a peace accord. It was Carter's best moment. Tenacity and persistence had paid off. And though parts of the accord pertaining to the Palestinian people were eventually not followed, Egypt and Israel have been at peace ever since. Now, sadly, Anwar Sadat was later assassinated by Islamic radicals. But, in spite of this, Egypt and Israel have been at peace ever since. Now, the Shah of Iran, who had left Iran, came down with cancer and was allowed into the United States for medical reasons. Iran was very angry. People protested, and students stormed the American embassy and took 52 Americans hostage. The Ayatollah Khomeini said that he would release those hostages if the United States would send the Shah back to stand trial. Carter said that no, the United States would not give in to blackmail. Now, many people wanted Carter to send battleships, go to war with Iran, but he was afraid that the hostages would get killed. And later, even when the Shah of Iran himself died of cancer and we couldn't send him back, Ayatollah Khomeini still wouldn't return the hostages. And guess what? For better or for worse, he became Time magazine's Man of the Year. Then the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and started a 9-year war. The U.S. would send arms to Afghanistan to help them fight the Soviets. Ironically, one of these Afghan leaders was Osama bin Laden. Well, Carter suspended the arms negotiations with the Soviet Union. He also put economic sanctions, and the United States boycotted the Moscow Olympics. It was also 1980. It was election year. And of all people, Edward Kennedy decided to challenge Jimmy Carter for the Democratic Party nomination. Jimmy Carter had become one of the most unpopular presidents ever. He was even less popular than Nixon. Now, Carter, who loved to jog, decided to participate in a 10-mile race. And guess what? He fainted. Then his brother Billy was caught taking money from Libyan officials to try to buy influence with the State Department. Jimmy Carter angrily had to distance himself from his own brother. And around this time, the Republicans chose a much more charismatic leader as their nominee for President of the United States. It was also around this time that Iraq decided to invade Iran, starting a decades-long war and further destabilizing the area. Well, Jimmy Carter needed to get some R&R. He needed to relax. So he went outside to fish one day, but he got attacked by a wild animal. What did he get attacked by? Well, he got attacked by a rabbit. Now, wild rabbits may be dangerous, I don't know, but the press had a field day with this. I guess you could say Carter couldn't catch a break. In Southeast Asia, Vietnam invaded Cambodia, and then China went along and invaded Vietnam. And by this point, Carter had had enough. It had been several months, so he authorized a rescue mission to get the hostages back. But then, well, the helicopters had a technical malfunction and they crashed in the desert. 8 soldiers died. Carter took full responsibility, and this time the nation mourned with him. However, the economy was still weak. The country did not like the direction it was taking. The hostages had been captive for over a year. And when November came, the people chose Ronald Reagan. Well, it would be a few more months until Ronald Reagan's inauguration day. So Carter took a breath, licked his wounds, and pushed on. He had frozen Iranians' assets in the banks, and now he was negotiating to return some of that money if Iran would release the hostages. He started negotiating, and he negotiated all the way to Inauguration Day, not sleeping the last couple of days. He was successful, but the Ayatollah kept the hostages on the ground and didn't release them until half an hour after Reagan became president. But no matter, Reagan sent Carter to Germany to greet the hostages. The long national nightmare was over. Carter was ecstatic, and so was the country. Everybody was happy and full of hope. Now, during the Carter years, serial killers Son of Sam and Ted Bundy were caught. John Wayne died, and so did Elvis Presley. Beatle John Lennon was shot dead, and recluse Howard Hughes had died. New TV shows came along, like Wonder Woman. Then came along Charlie's Angels and Sanford and Son. Then, of course, the birth of Robin Williams on the TV show Mork and Mindy. It was also the disco era, time for Saturday Night Fever. Donna Summers came along, and so did Linda Ronstadt. The worst nuclear disaster happened on 3 Mile Island. And several movies popped out. There was Superman. There was Robert De Niro doing Raging Bull, and then, of course, The Deer Hunter. Along came the film Apocalypse Now, and, of course, everybody's favorite, Star Wars. Well, Carter returned to Plains, Georgia. He felt hurt, defeated, rejected, but he was not the relaxing kind, and he threw himself into projects like Habitat for Humanity. He assisted in fair elections, supervising them all over the world, and promoted peace through the Carter Center. If Carter had not lost the election, we may not have had the Carter Center. Carter was an unsuccessful president, but he became one of the best ex-presidents we've ever had. And if he's ever remembered for anything, he should be remembered for helping eradicate diseases like the guinea worm, malaria, and river blindness. Now, everybody look at this statistic that we have in 1986. There were 3.5 million new cases of the guinea worm disease, but by 2015, there were only 22. For all his efforts, Carter was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And now in his 90s, Jimmy Carter and the Carter Center is still going strong. This is Cool Talk.